Where's everybody? Usually we have more people by now. Did I forget to put the link up? I know I put the link up. What's up, Andy? All right, folks. Well, we're going to get started because it's time. I'm going to pop this over to my desktop so you guys can see the PowerPoint. All right, so the last time that we met on Monday, we were talking about conservatism. And now we're going to be switching to a new ism of the day, and that's going to be liberalism. So let's talk about liberalism a little bit. Now, we've talked about liberalism before. To be clear, you know, we've learned about liberalism because it's one of the tenets of the Enlightenment period, right? The Enlightenment philosophers were preoccupied with liberalism as being a facet of life. And many of them strove for more liberal policies surrounding freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. And so these ideas of liberalism are going to sound familiar to you. Of course, when we're talking about the people who would have subscribed to the liberal philosophy back in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, we would have been referring to the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class, right? The people, the group of people who principally were responsible for the, promulgating the French Revolution and so on. Anyhow, let's talk about how liberalism continues to manifest during the early 19th century as we move into the era of industry and the post-Napoleonic era of Europe, which is 1815 and afterwards. And so the rise of liberalism was unleashed by the French Revolution, and it was largely kept in check during the years following the Congress of Vienna. So liberalism, people had gotten their first sweet taste of liberalism during the French Revolution, Napoleonic years. And then once Napoleon is vanquished, all these conservative powers in Europe are doing their best they can to put the lid back on liberalism. They don't want it spreading. They don't want liberally inspired revolutions. They don't want more wars, because to the conservatives, liberalism had ripped apart the fabric of what they understood European society to be. So it was kept in check, and liberalism became a major force in France during the new revolutions of 1830 and 1848. France is going to go through two separate revolutions in 1830 and 1848. So just to give you a little preview of that, and we will talk more about it later, but I'm just going to mention this right now so it's on your radar. After Napoleon is vanquished, they bring back the Bourbon dynasty. I think I mentioned that. And I believe the Bourbon king that they put back on the throne is Charles the 10th of France. Charles the 10th. Charles X, okay? As I know him, Professor X. No, I'm just kidding with you. Okay, so, but the point being that Charles the 10th was the Bourbon king that's sitting on the throne after Napoleon. And, you know, the French weren't really big on that. You know, the Bourbon dynasty was really pretty unpopular because of Louis XVI and the whole French Revolution in the first place. So the Bourbons get overthrown in 1830. So they're in power for about 15 years, and they are replaced with a new king. And his name is Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe, okay? Is how you pronounce his name. A lot of kids look at that and they think it's like Louis Philippe or something like, no, all right, he's French. Louis Philippe, okay? And he is known as, he's nicknamed the bourgeois king, all right? Louis Philippe. And Louis Philippe is the king of France for 18 years, until a new revolution of 1848. And in 1848, technically, France became a republic again, but for only 4 years. And that's because a new guy comes to power in 1848, who we will also learn about in France. His name was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay, Louis Napoleon. And so, now I know that it's almost like a joke now. Okay, how many people in France can there be named Louis? The answer is a whole lot. And so, and now we're even adding, now we're combining names. Now it's Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. I mean, really? Come on. Anyway, so the point is that Louis Philippe loses his ability. He's forced to abdicate from the throne in 1848. Okay, he's forced to step down, and the new leader of France becomes Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, otherwise known as Napoleon the Third. Okay, the third. Why not the second? Because Napoleon the First, okay, the Napoleon that everyone knows, had a son named Napoleon, and when Napoleon I died, Napoleon's son became technically Napoleon II. But Napoleon II was Napoleon's son was unhealthy, not particularly of robust constitution, and so he dies relatively young in life. I think he makes it into his early 20s or something like that, but I think he dies of tuberculosis, if my memory serves me correctly. Just kind of not a very healthy person in general. And so he dies pretty young. And Louis Napoleon is going to be Napoleon's nephew, I believe, or like distant nephew. Anyway, point being that he's the new leader of France, and in 1848, and he becomes actually Emperor of France in 1852, just 4 years after France became a republic again. Now again, I'm mentioning all of this now, but we will go into much more detail on all of these changes in a different lecture, but I'm just giving you a preview of how liberalism manifests in France while the Congress of Vienna's trying to stop liberalism from spreading. Liberalism also resulted in a number of very important reforms in Britain during this time by 1850, and we've learned about some of them. The Reform Bill of 1832, the repeal of the Corn Laws. I've talked to you about the Corn Laws before. Just to remind you what the Corn Laws were, the Corn Laws were a protective tariff on British grain. Okay, and British people hated them because what it did was it meant that all foreign produced grain, which was cheaper than British grain, and you might be wondering why do they call it the Corn Laws if it has to do with like wheat and barley and oats and stuff like that? Well, in Britain, corn is just it's a generic term for grain, all right, at the time. And so the Corn Laws, it's not about corn on the cob, it's about British grain. But anyway, point being that they put the price of foreign grain to be higher than British grain, which meant that people were purchasing expensive British grown grain for the purposes of making bread just for survival. And they didn't like that because it's manipulating the market. The Corn Laws were really anti-liberal, all right, because it's controlling the economy. Remember, liberals of this time believed that the economy should be free, okay? They believed that the government should stay out of the economy and it should be laissez-faire. So the repeal of the Corn Laws, when they get rid of that protective tariff, is a liberal triumph, and that happens in 1846. Liberalism, proponents of liberalism, Adam Smith, we've learned about him, Wealth of Nations, father of capitalism, laissez-faire, law of competition, law of supply and demand, law of self-interest. Okay, all of those ideas that accompany the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's work on capitalism. And another guy who we're going to be reading a piece from today by the name of John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill wrote a famous piece known as On Liberty, and we'll be talking about that today. We'll actually be reading an excerpt of that together in class today. And we have to understand that the liberals of this time have a progressive viewpoint, okay? These days, okay, classical liberals, all right, actually more would probably subscribe to, in America, modern day American political views of conservatism. That's the thing that makes it so confusing. Modern day conservatives in America are the ones that typically advocate most doggedly for a free market economy, all right? And the reason for this is because now, you know, liberal economics have existed in America for 200 years, all right? That's a pretty long time. And so, you know, modern day conservatives want to see a more free market economy the way that the economy used to be earlier on in America's history. And in that sense, they're trying to, if we're looking at it from the perspective of the 21st century, they're trying to return it to the status quo of a more free market economy. Modern day American liberals typically are a little bit more in favor of a what is now termed a progressive viewpoint of more market controls, trying to level the playing ground a little bit, provide assistance to needy families. Modern day liberals are typically in favor of more socialized programs paid for by tax dollars. And of course, I'm speaking broadly here. So, you know, not every single person who calls themselves a liberal in the United States, you know, wants to see more socialized systems in place. But generally, just speaking broadly, the more radical liberals in our current government, let's say people like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or people like that, are they're probably more in favor of seeing government programs put into place paid for by tax dollars that assist people who are in need. That said, in this time, liberalism was considered a progressive viewpoint because they were trying to implement free market capitalist policies and expand industrialization, particularly in Britain. And they are against absolutism because they feel it goes against the natural order of things. And they're in favor of laissez-faire economics, free market, hands off. Government keeps the hands off the economy. And they believed, liberals of this time believed that people's natural rights are inalienable, all right? And that written constitutions, which conservatives said were had held no more weight than the paper they were written on, okay? Conversely, liberals felt that written constitutions were necessary to protect these rights because the British in particular, but also a lot of other European nations, but it really started with the British and the Dutch, were very big on record keeping. And, the British, nothing was official in the mind of a British person until it was written down in a contract. And we very much still hold those tenets today. If you make a business deal with somebody, you want to have it written on paper, you want to have their signature on it, because when it's written down, all right, it becomes a historical record. And that in the minds of a lot of people, that brings it more weight, okay? And so if you were ever to go to court with somebody and you don't have any written documents or contracts or anything like that, your case is probably going to lose because you need those kinds of pieces of evidence to substantiate prior business agreements and stuff like that. So that's why they feel like these constitutions should be written down to protect these people's rights. Okay, we want to be clear on something, though, because there is a little bit of confusion sometimes that surrounds liberalism. We need to be clear that just because we're talking about people advocating for written constitutions and free market capitalism, which are things that we hold close to our hearts here in America, it is not democracy that they are really aiming for at this time. We have to understand that 19th century liberals were made up of the bourgeois class. The bourgeoisie is a select group of people who is trying to increase both their political and economic power. And 19th century bourgeois liberals were every bit as afraid of the tyranny of the majority as they were of absolutism. All right, liberals of this time may have been advocating for certain policies that we intrinsically agree with in terms of freedom and capitalism and stuff like that here in the United States on a broad level, but they didn't want to see everybody magically get the right to vote, because they were concerned that if everybody had the right to vote, that would mean that a lot of people who don't really know what they're talking about or don't really have an exiguous understanding of the workings of politics and the economy and so on would be able to participate in this and throw a giant wrench into the entire system and get a bunch of crazy laws passed. And so the liberals at this time are not in favor of democracy. They are in favor of written constitutions that protect people's rights. They are in favor of capitalism and free market economies, but they are not in favor of democracy on a broad scale. They were in favor of, for example, limitations that would still exclude large portions of the population who were landless and didn't have any property from being able to participate in government. All right, so they favored property qualifications for voting, meaning that you would not be able to vote unless you had a certain amount of land that you could call your own. The impact of liberalism. It, of course, inspired many, many revolutionary movements in the early 19th century. It also influenced the revolutions in France in both 1838 and 1848, the ones that I told you about a few minutes ago in France. And liberalism became embodied in over 10 constitutions that were secured between 1815 and 1848 in various states of the German Confederation. So even though the Concert of Europe is doing their absolute best to try to stamp out liberalism and secure a conservative order where legitimate absolute monarchs were on the throne and people's rights were curtailed and they were trying to create a balance of power and all of that stuff, they are still unable to completely do away with liberal sentiments among the bourgeois class. So let's talk a little bit more here just to sum up on liberalism. Who are going to be the people who are most advocating liberalism? It's going to be the bourgeoisie, the urban middle class for the most part, which is growing, okay, particularly in England by the time that we get to about 1830, 1840. The bourgeois class of Britain is definitely growing. We are seeing, as many of you wrote, by the way, I wanted to mention to you guys, I graded your tests yesterday. I went into work yesterday. I got to work probably about, I don't know, maybe about 7 o'clock yesterday morning, and I was there until about 2:30 in the afternoon. And I got all those tests graded, and I was looking over your guys' short answer questions, and I have to say that I was extraordinarily impressed by a handful of some of the responses that I saw from you guys. Some folks struggled more than others, as always on a test, but a good number of you really did a fabulous job on your short answers, providing specific evidence and clarity on things. And it's nice because I can see that you guys are improving in your writing, and that's always really, really nice to see. So I just wanted to make sure that I made mention of that. And I know I put a post up yesterday of a handful of knuckleheads that I suspect probably did not take the test in the most honest fashion, but for the most part, the writing section, exploits those kinds of things, and I was pretty impressed overall with a lot of people's responses on the short answer section. So I just wanted to make mention of that. Okay, so the bourgeoisie, the urban middle class, is going to be the social group that's most commonly in favor of liberal policies. Buzzwords that surround liberalism are going to be things like liberty, obviously, freedom, okay, laissez-faire, meaning hands off the economy. Government keeps its hands, the two things are separate. Government minds its own business and lets the economy do what it does. Reform would be another one, or progressive viewpoints would be another one. Progress or reform is another term that you may see associated with liberalism of the early 19th century. Constitutions, right? Remember that liberals were heavily in favor of written constitutions that guaranteed people's inalienable natural rights, which happens to be another term that I have here that's a buzzword. Natural rights, life, liberty, property, John Locke, right? All of those kinds of things. And then two, equality. Not equality in the sense of economic equality, okay? When I talk about equality when it comes to classical liberals, I'm more talking about legal equality, okay? That everybody has the same natural rights and everybody's rights should be equally protected by the government, all right? But when I say equality, I'm not talking about equality of wealth. Liberals would not have been in favor of redistributing wealth and making everybody equal in their monetary standing. All right, so I just want to make sure that I clarify that. Liberalism in the early days of the 19th century tends to mix really well with nationalism. All right. Remember, though, that that as time goes on, liberalism and nationalism prove not to be as good of a partnership with one another as conservatism and nationalism are in the late 19th century. After 1848, we increasingly see nationalism becoming more associated with conservative politics in the age of realpolitik, which follows all of these revolutions of 1848. Liberalism tends to not play as well with conservatism, right? Obviously, because the conservatives are trying to shut down liberalism during this era. And it obviously is not going to play well with socialism. Socialism is, heavy government interference and redistribution of wealth and things like that. The liberals of this time would have been 100% against that. And then romanticism. Again, I struggle on that one. We typically associate romanticism more with conservatism because it's focusing on the beauty of nature and the rustic quality of bringing things back to the way they were. But if we're looking at the spirit of liberalism at this time, we could definitely say that the liberal spirit was in some sense romantic, because the conservatives of this time, the liberals of this time are very idealistic in terms of how they view new liberal revolutions taking place. And we could say that because the views of the liberals are somewhat idealistic, perhaps their expectations were romanticized. So that term romanticism is a tricky one because depending on how you're talking about it, it could technically go to describe either conservatism or liberalism, but I digress. The point being, to move on, there are several names that you'll want to associate with liberalism. Adam Smith, definitely for classical economic liberalism, is first and foremost. John Stuart Mill would be another, and then Frederick Bastiat would be a third. And then documents, okay? Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, John Stuart Mill's on Liberty, and Frederick Bastiat's The Law. Each of these being documents that you could point to that would serve as good evidence of liberal ideas. Okay, so here is John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. This is just a short quote. We're going to read more of this in just a second here, but this is John Stuart Mill over on the right-hand side here. Two maxims of liberalism, okay? The two maxims. A maxim is a truth, okay? A truth. It's an unwavering truth. And so John Stuart Mill famously identified two maxims of liberalism. The maxims are, first, that the individual is not accountable to society for his actions insofar as these actions concern the interests of no person but himself. Let me be clear on what John Stuart Mill is saying here, okay? The individual is not accountable to society for his actions, okay? But there's a caveat there. The caveat being, okay, or the exception being that the individual is not accountable to society for his actions insofar as these concern the interests of no person but himself. So, in other words, as long as a person is acting freely and not hindering the lives of another in that process, they are only accountable to themselves, okay? You could see, though, a number of situations that could develop where a person acting in their own self-interest could do harm to others in society. All right? Let me give you an example, the most common example of, let's say, freedom of speech, okay? We know in our modern day times that there are just certain things that you don't say, okay, because they could put other people and their well-being in jeopardy. All right. So, for example, if you're in a crowded concert or movie theater or whatever, okay, and you yell fire and there is no fire, and people start panicking and then running out and getting trampled and stuff like that, John Stuart Mill would not be okay with that, because in that situation you are accountable for your actions to society, because your actions directly led to other people in society being harmed, okay? Putting other people in harm's way. Same thing if you created panic at an airport by yelling bomb in the airport or something like that. That's going to cause people to freak out. And so in that situation, you are accountable, because that's not just concerning the interest of yourself, that's concerning the well-being and the interests of other people around you. All right? And that's not what John Stuart Mill is talking about. What John Stuart Mill is talking about is, on a personal level, when you are operating in your own personal self-interest for your own betterment of your own self, and it's not causing harm to others around you in any direct measurable way, then you don't have to be worried about your accountability to society, because you are acting as a free individual. Secondly, the second maxim is that for such actions as are prejudicial to the interests of others, okay, the individual is accountable and may be subjected either to social or to legal punishment. I'd like to take a minute here to talk a little bit about this phrase that maybe you have heard of before, that has been kind of a buzzword that's been floating around in the last few years, of cancel culture, okay? Cancel culture. The most recent example of cancel culture that has been circulating in the news recently was the story of this lady from the series Mandalorian. Maybe you heard about this. There's a lady, she plays this kind of tough chick in the Mandalorian series, and she's an actress. I think she's like a former fighter or something like that. But she came out on some social media platform and made some comment to the effect of basically putting modern day conservatives and comparing the experience of modern day conservatives to Jewish folks who lived through the Holocaust. And on the surface, of course, we can just speaking. This is not a partisan statement. This is just a statement rooted in my education in history. There is absolutely nothing that links the experiences of modern day conservatives in America to the experiences of Jewish folks and the other 5.5 million people who went through the Holocaust. Okay, there's nothing that they have in common. Let's be clear on that. All right, just from a purely fact-based perspective. Okay, that's based purely on fact. All right. The issue surrounding cancel culture is that she got fired by Disney, who was, of course, her employer, because she worked on The Mandalorian. All Star Wars Star Wars is owned by Disney. She got fired by Disney. She's not on the show anymore. And she came out and she said that she's the most recent victim of cancel culture. Okay? Meaning that when people express their own point of view and it is not received well by the rest of society, and then there are repercussions to that, that people are then victims of being canceled and their reputations go down and so on. All right. Cancel culture is a new term. Okay, it's only been around for a few years, and it describes a phenomenon that has always existed. All right, it's always existed in modern day society. Okay, modern free, liberal societies like America. Okay, just because a person has the freedom of speech, okay, you're free to say whatever you want to say, for the most part. Okay, there's a handful of situations, like I gave you earlier about yelling fire and stuff like that, that are legally punishable because you're directly putting other people's safety in jeopardy. Okay, but for a thing like what's her face, you know, a comment like what's her face made on social media, she's allowed to say that. She's not going to go to jail for that. Okay, she's not going to be criminally prosecuted for putting her ideas out there. She's free to say those. Legally, she is free to say those things. All right? But let me take you back to what John Stuart Mill said. That for such actions as are prejudicial to the interests of others, the individual is accountable and may be subjected either to social, or to legal punishment. Let's be clear on what cancel culture is. It is exactly what John Stuart Mill is saying here when he wrote On Liberty in 1830, which is that if you say something that annoys other people, offends other people, makes other people say, no, you're wrong, you are going to face social consequences for that. And those social consequences in modern day times have started to be termed cancel culture. But cancel culture is a way of victimizing, self-victimizing, okay? Your own self, you're making yourself a victim by saying, well, just because I expressed my opinion on something, now you're canceling me. Well, yeah, because if you say something that's ludicrous and stupid, okay, of course people are going to come out and say, no, you're wrong. You know, that's what freedom of speech guarantees. Just because somebody has an opinion on something and expresses it, if you are putting your own personal opinions out there, you have to understand that what goes along with the responsibility of freedom of speech is that other people also have it. Which means that if a wide, vast majority of the population comes out and says, hey, no, you're wrong, your idea is ridiculous, and I don't subscribe to that, that is one of the natural consequences that's going to happen. That's how freedom of speech works. It's worked that way ever since the start. Go back to the 1950s. Were the communists victims of cancel culture? Maybe, okay? But if you called yourself a communist back in the 1950s, you would have been, no matter how passionate, no matter how well-reasoned you would have immediately put yourself onto a list of people that others did not want to associate with, okay? And you're gonna become an exile among the majority. And people are going to look at you and not agree with your opinions. They're going to think that you've lost your mind, and so on and so forth. So let's be clear about what cancel culture is. Cancel culture holds people accountable for what they say in the public forum if they say something that's stupid. Okay? Now, are there times, here's the other side of it, dangerous side of freedom of speech. What happens if the majority of people believe something ridiculous? And then somebody in the minority comes out and says, I think your ideas are wrong. And immediately they get cancel cultured because of it. That's a concerning thing. That's a concerning thing. Because now you're dealing with a society that could potentially overlook good ideas in the name of supporting bad ones that are already a preponderance of people already subscribed to. Take, for example, Nazi Germany. Okay, there were a lot of bad things going on in Nazi Germany. There was a lot of discriminatory laws passed against Jewish folks, violence against people, laws being broken, outlawing other political parties, outlawing dissent, and we see a fascist dictator come to power in Adolf Hitler. In that scenario where the Nazis are in complete control of the government and somebody else in the minority comes out and says, I don't subscribe to Nazi ideals, in a totalitarian, unfree government, which is one of the big differences that we're talking about here. Remember that totalitarianism doesn't support liberalism at all. It's completely controlled. There is no freedom in a totalitarian society. Everything's controlled by the state. And so, in that scenario, precisely because people don't have freedom of speech, if you say something that goes against the majority ruling in power, they can imprison you, they can perhaps murder you or whatever. And that's a slippery slope. This is sometimes known as the paradox of the freedom of speech, okay? Because what happens in a lot of scenarios, and something that we need to be extremely cautious of going into the future here in the 21st century, something that I hope that you take with you as you move beyond the class, is that there are people in democratic free societies who will beat the drum of freedom of speech over and over and over and over again in order to get wackier and wackier ideas to become more acceptable. Once those wackier ideas start to be more widely subscribed to, and let's say a strong man or a dictator ends up manipulating the population, riding the horse of freedom of speech all the way, because that's the only way they can get radical ideas out there, okay, that most people are not going to be comfortable with. Once they finally come to power, then the first thing that they do is they curtail freedom of speech rights and legally punish or imprison people who are once again expressing their own freedom of speech. But now that this totalitarian dictator has come to power, and by the way, this happened. The reason that I'm saying this is because this happened. It happened in Nazi Germany, okay? Once the dictator comes to power, the first thing they do is they turn their backs on freedom of speech and they say, now that we're in charge, anyone who says anything against what we say is going to jail. That's the danger. That's the danger. And what's really dangerous about it is it's built on the majority. And because Hitler didn't come to power by being a clunky dummy, okay? Hitler was a cunning politician. And he used speeches, and he used propaganda, and he used manipulation of the masses in order to gain people's trust and support. And once he had the majority of the population in his stranglehold, everybody already believes in him unwaveringly. So when he starts making moves like getting rid of freedom of speech, creating discriminatory laws, and so on and so forth, people go along with it. And it doesn't happen overnight. It took Hitler years to be able to harness the power of the population. But once he did that, then he was able to take away people's freedom of speech. He was able to outlaw any dissenting political parties. He was able to discriminate against Jewish folks, gypsies, homosexuals, people with mental or physical disabilities, things like that. And the population went along with it. Because by that point, the population is now in such a state of perpetual fear, because this is what dictators do. They stoke chaos. Dictators power-hungry, narcissistic dictators stoke chaos, because chaos creates uncertainty. And people don't like uncertainty. People don't like feeling afraid. And when they do, they look to those very same strong men to restore order, even though they're usually the ones that created the chaos in the first place. You know? Hitler famously, and we'll learn about this when we get to World War II, Hitler famously burned down the Reichstag and then turned around and blamed the communists for it. The Reichstag is the parliamentary building of Germany. And he blamed the communists for it. He's literally the one that created this chaotic situation, but then deliberately twists the story, lies to the people, who then believe him because they're so freaked out that the Reichstag just got burned down. And then they look to him, even though he's the one who did it, they look to him to be the one to restore order. Classic textbook move of power-hungry dictators. Create chaos, ride the freedom of speech horse all the way until you obtain power, and then immediately turn around and say, I'm the only one who can restore order, and so no one else has a say in anything. I really hope you remember this, okay? I really hope you remember this, because these things have happened. If you know your history, they don't have to happen again. You know? We can avoid having crises develop like that. I'll step down off of my soapbox. Now, before we, by the way, before we move on, any comments? I want to make sure that you guys know you are welcome. If you want to interject, if you have questions, if you think I'm off base or whatever, tell me. And let's have a conversation about it, okay? I'm not going to get offended, all right? Do I think I know everything? No, all right? If you have ideas, or if you have comments, or if you have thoughts on what I just said, I would love for you to share them so that we can have a discussion about it. That's what school's about. We should be able to have academic discussions about these kinds of things. So if you want to, turn this into a conversation, I'm happy to do so. But any comments on that? Questions? Anything? Before I move on to the next thing? All right. Well, let me swap it back over here to the desktop. And I'd like to pull up now John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. Let's see this one here. That's the whole thing. I don't need the whole thing. All right, let's look at this one here. This is short. We'll make our way through this here, okay? And I just want to read for you John Stuart Mill's actual words. Remember, he is a liberal. So here we go. Let's read this together. John Stuart Mill, who lived from 1806 to 1873, had already learned Greek and Latin by age 12. I want you to consider that for just a second, all right? Greek and Latin by age 12, as well as received a rigorous education in math, economics, and philosophy. He published works on politics, society, and economics, including on liberty, considerations on representative government, utilitarianism, which is another ism we're going to be learning about, and the subjection of women in 1869. John Stuart Mill was rather forward-thinking when it came to women's rights for a 19th century gentleman. Many of his ideas were deemed radical during his day, but have since become established ideas in liberal thought. He authored works with his wife, Harriet Taylor, and advocated the right to vote and equal rights for women. Uncommon for his time. John Stuart Mill is awesome. Let's read what he says here. The object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle, as entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control, whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted individually or collectively in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because in the opinions of others to do so would be wise or even right. These are good reasons for remonstrating him or reasoning with him or persuading him or entreating him, but not for compelling him or visiting him with any evil in case he do otherwise. What he is basically saying here is this: if a person says something, okay, that seemingly goes against the collective understanding of society, that's a great opportunity to, talk to him, have a conversation, etc., but not for forcing people to change their opinions or for legally punishing people or whatever. Okay? Let's move on. The only part of the conduct of any one for which he is amenable to society is that which concerns others. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute. In other words, people are individually free to say what they want to say. That's not saying that society won't come out and argue with you or present counter evidence or whatever, but you are nonetheless still free to say what you like. Over himself, his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. That is for all issues pertaining solely to yourself. If an issue that you are speaking on causes harm to others, that means that others may come back at you. The only, let's see here. It is perhaps hardly necessary to say that this doctrine is meant to apply only to human beings in the maturity of their faculties. We are not speaking of children or of young persons below the age which the law may fix as that of manhood or womanhood. So he's basically saying here, kids are going to say stupid things, okay? And there are times where kids need to be reprimanded so that they learn how to properly function in society as a full-fledged adult, okay? Those who are in a state to require being taken care of by others must be protected against their own actions as well as against external injury. For the same reason, we may leave out of consideration those backward states of society in which the race itself may be considered in its nonage. That's a little bit racist, okay? Because basically this is a, keep in mind, he is a man of his time, if nothing else. And the prevailing opinion of Europeans at this time, such as John Stuart Mill, would have been that other segments of the world, of societies across the world, had not yet been exposed to the blessings of European civilization in the Enlightenment and so on, industrialization, etc. The early difficulties in the way of spontaneous progress are so great that there is seldom any choice of means for overcoming them, and a ruler full of the spirit of improvement is warranted in the use of any expedients that will attain an end, perhaps otherwise unattainable. Despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement and the means justified by actually effecting that end. Liberty, as a principle, has no application to any state of things anterior to the time when mankind have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. Basically, he's saying until a society goes through the Enlightenment, these discussions are a moot point. Until then, there is nothing for them but implicit obedience to an Akbar or a Charlemagne, if they are so fortunate as to find one. But as soon as mankind have attained the capacity of being guided to their own improvement by conviction or persuasion, a period long since reached in all nations with whom we need here concern ourselves, compulsion, either in the direct form or in that of pains and penalties for non-compliance, is no longer admissible as a means to their own good and justifiable only for the security of others. Moving down to this bottom section here. What then is the rightful limit to the to the sovereignty of the individual over himself? Where does the authority of society begin? How much of human life should be assigned to individuality and how much to society? Each will receive its proper share if each has that which more particularly concerns it. To individuality should belong the part of life in which it is chiefly the individual that is interested. To society, the part which chiefly interests society. So he's saying here basically, freedom, liberty, is most concerning to the individual. And when we talk about individuality and the rights that the individual should have, we should be speaking most principally about those issues that concern chiefly the individual. If we're talking about the greater good of society and the extent to which freedom should be applied across society, we need to be looking at issues that are most chiefly concerned with society. Though society is not founded on a contract, and though no good purpose is answered by inventing a contract in order to deduce social obligations from it, everyone who receives the protection of society owes a return for the benefit. And the fact of living in society renders it indispensable that each should be bound to observe a certain line of conduct towards the rest. In other words, he's not saying that everybody should just go out and act however they want. That is not at all what John Stuart Mill is saying. What he's saying is that because everybody is themselves an individual, but also inseparably a part of society, that there has to be some line, okay, a certain line that people need to observe in terms of their conduct towards the rest of society. If everybody went out and acted only on their own personal self-interest, who knows how chaotic society would become? Okay? It could get really crazy. This conduct consists first in not injuring the interests of one another, or rather certain interests which either by express legal provision or by tacit understanding ought to be considered as rights. And secondly, in each person's bearing his share, to be fixed on some equitable principle, of the labors and sacrifices incurred for defending the society or its members from injury and molestation. Molestation, he's referring to that not in like a sexual assault way. He's talking about like in a broader societal kind of sense where people do harm to others. Okay, these conditions society is justified in enforcing at all costs to those who endeavor to withhold fulfillment. Nor is this all that society may do. The acts of an individual may be hurtful to others or wanting in due consideration for their welfare without going the length of violating any of their constituted rights. The offender may be justly punished by opinion, though not by law. And that's exactly what he's talking about here with that whole cancel culture thing, okay? If we're talking about people who say things that are offensive to others, even if you haven't directly offended their rights or taken other people's rights away from them, if you're saying hurtful things to others, or if you're purposefully spreading damaging or destructive propaganda or things like that, these kinds of offenses may be justly punished by social opinion, but they should not be punished by law. People, in other words, he is of the opinion that this woman from Star Wars, if John Stuart Mill were alive today observing this, he would basically say, yeah, you said something dumb. When you say dumb things, society's going to come back and say, hello, you're dumb, okay? You shouldn't have said that, or whatever. But he also would have said that she still should have the right to say it, okay, and not have to worry about going to jail for saying something stupid, all right? And she's not going to. But that doesn't mean she couldn't lose her job, because she was hired by a private company. Private companies own their own company. They can do whatever they want. So as soon as any part of a person's conduct affects prejudicially the interest of others, society has jurisdiction over it, and the question whether the general welfare will or will not be promoted by interfering with it becomes open to discussion. But there is no room for entertaining any such question when a person's conduct affects the interests of no persons beside himself, or needs not affect them unless they, like all the persons concerning being of full age and the ordinary amount of understanding. In all, I kind of screwed up that last sentence, but anyway, in all such cases there should be perfect freedom, legal and social, to do the action and stand the consequences. Okay, so this is that excerpt from On Liberty. It is obviously written at a very collegiate level, so you may not have gotten every single last bit out of that. Nonetheless, it's still, extremely good, guys. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty is probably one of the most amazing essays on freedom of speech. And just in general liberalism, but specifically freedom of speech. And anyway, I love that piece, and I think it's extremely powerful, and it's extremely wise and very ahead of its time. So anyhow, that's my thoughts on that. All right, conservative opposition. Metternich blamed liberalism for the wars and upheavals between 1789 and 1815. Self-determination, as John Stuart Mill was just talking about, okay, self-determination individuals determining their own individual national identity in this sense, was dangerous in particular to the Austrian Empire. The Austrian Empire, you might remember, was a multi-ethnic empire, and it was made up of a whole lot of different kinds of people. If liberalism started spreading around amongst the Hungarians, amongst the Romanians, amongst the Bulgarians, amongst the Serbs, the Bosnians, the Croats, you name it, okay, Slovenes. There's so many different kinds of people who lived within the boundaries of the Austrian Empire that liberal revolutions in that empire could have really caused it to fragment and crumble. So in particular, we can understand why guys like Metternich and the nobles of the the Austrian Empire, were so paranoid about stamping out liberal revolutions everywhere, because Austria is well aware of the fact that if these peoples of different ethnic backgrounds who lived within the boundaries of the Austrian Empire realized, like, hey, I don't feel Austrian, I don't speak German, I don't even live near Vienna, I shouldn't be controlled by these people, it could have led to a domino effect of a bunch of different ethnic groups, each of them breaking away and causing Austria a tremendous amount of internal conflict. And so this helps to explain a little bit why these Eastern empires, like the German Empire, like the Austrian Empire, and the Russian Empire, each were so vested in protecting conservative, absolutist ideals. All right, folks. So that brings us to the end of our lecture for today. I'd just like to say thanks so much for tuning in. I will be putting up the new assignment for the reading guide on Canvas. And so please get that done by Friday. And then on Friday, when we reconvene, we will be talking about nationalism. We'll be talking about utopian socialism, and making our way through the rest of this unit. Even though we just started it, we've got plenty more to go, but that will be what we do on Friday. So please get the new questions done for the reading guide, and we'll see you at the end of the week. Have a happy Wednesday, everybody.